Galactic Council exiled Earth. Humanity built an empire mightier than all. The rail driver round hit before Toralkai's sensors even registered a launch. His bridge crew didn't scream. They didn't have time. 1 second the tactical display showed a proud line of 150 Synarchy hulls holding formation at the edge of the dark. The next, 3 of them were gone, their hull plating scattered into a spray of glowing debris that spun off into the void without sound. "Report," Toralkai said. His voice came out flat. His mandibles didn't move right when he said it, the way they usually did. Nobody reported anything. The comms officer just stared at her console, where a wall of red contact icons had bloomed out of nowhere, arranged in a shape no threat assessment file in the Hegemony's archive had ever logged. 300 years of silence, and the outer void had teeth. The ships weren't sleek. They weren't polished chrome or ceremonial gold like a Synarchy capital line. They were black iron slabs, raw and unfinished, built the way a hammer is built, for one purpose, with nothing wasted on looking beautiful doing it. Toralkai had seen the file on humanity before he crossed the horizon line. Zero Navy infrastructure, the file said. A dead species holding on by scraps in a dead sector. The file was wrong. He understood that now, watching a second wave of his fleet lose power across every deck at once. No warning shot, no hail, no mercy. His shield officer's hands were shaking over the console. "Marshal, our targeting arrays can't lock. Everything's reading white. It's like the whole sector's screaming static at once." Toralkai leaned toward the viewport. Out past the wreck of his third dreadnought, something enormous was beginning to take shape in the dust, a shadow with a hull long enough to blot out the nearest dying star. He had crossed this line, believing there was nothing left to conquer. He was about to learn what 300 years of nothing could build. I wish I could tell you the story ends there, with the Marshal frozen at his viewport. It doesn't. Stay close. The part that got him there started 3 centuries earlier in a much quieter room. The clerk filed the transfer under dead mass. Humanity's ledger was stamped with an unread ink 0, and nobody in the chamber looked twice at it. The grand hall of the Synarchy judicial citadel did not deal in justice. It dealt in architecture built to make young species feel small ceiling panels that curved away into a false sky, columns wide enough to hide a shuttle behind, and at the very top of it all, a dais where High Arbiter Vexarin stood in jade-plated robes, looking down at the tiny space assigned to Sol. His crest feathers had gone a pale, brittle white. They always did that under stress, though after 600 years of handing down decrees, Vexarin had learned to enjoy the feeling. Stress meant power was being used. "By vote of this council," he said, and his voice carried the dry click that punctuated every sentence he spoke, "the Terran system is stripped of its provisional charter. Effective immediately, the species designated human is exiled beyond the horizon line, into the region catalogued as the outer void." The vote hadn't been close. Ambassador Mag Dunn sat in the small human delegation box, her old brass-rimmed pen resting on a physical paper ledger most of the chamber had forgotten humans still used. She didn't stand. She didn't argue. She marked something in the margin of her page, closed the cover, and set the pen down beside it like she was finishing a grocery list. "Ambassador," Vexarin said, "you may address the council before sentence is carried out." Dunn looked up at him through thick spectacles. For a moment the chamber held its breath, waiting for the plea, the outrage, the theatre every Exile hearing was supposed to produce. She stood, adjusted her jacket, and walked out. No parting words, no last look at the dais, just the sound of her shoes on stone growing fainter until the doors sealed behind her with a heavy, final clunk that echoed longer than anyone expected. A younger delegate, seated beside the empty human box, leaned toward his neighbor. She didn't even ask for terms. "Why would she?" the neighbor murmured. "There's nothing left to negotiate for." Vexarin watched the doors for a long moment after Dunn had gone. Then he clicked once, dismissively, and moved on to the next item on the docket. He did not wonder what a species does with 300 years and nothing left to lose. It did not occur to him to ask. For 300 cycles, the rule at the horizon line was absolute. No human hull crossed the perimeter. No human signal reached Synarchy relay stations. The Grand Ledger left the Sol sector unmonitored and blank, and the blank space suited everyone just fine. For 300 cycles, the Council told itself the same story. A species with no fleet, no allies, and no resources had been sent into a starless graveyard, and graveyards did not send return mail. Command Marshal Toralkai kept a threat file on the Exiled sector because policy required it, and updated it exactly never because policy didn't require that part. The file said human industrial capacity, negligible. It had said that for 3 centuries. He'd stopped reading past the first line years ago. Observer Leasai read every line. That was the difference. Leasai was Varley, a species built low and quick, with scales that ticked faintly when anxious, and lately the ticking hadn't stopped. 6 months into a routine mapping sweep of the dead systems past the boundary, the numbers had started doing something they weren't supposed to do. Leasai brought the report to Vexaran personally. That alone should have meant something. Leasai never came in person. High Arbiter, the mass surveys from Sector 7 Omega don't reconcile. Something is moving material out there. A great deal of material. Vexaran didn't look up from his own console. Define a great deal. Trillions of tons of high iron ore redistributed across 3 decades. It isn't natural drift. Natural drift doesn't organize itself into patterns. Scrap foraging, Vexaran said. Primitives picking through wreckage for salvage. It happens in every dead sector in the galaxy. Primitives don't move ore in patterns that match refinery logistics. That got Vexaran's attention for exactly as long as it took him to click his tongue and wave a hand. Humanity has no refineries. Humanity has no shipyards. Humanity, observer, has no navy. File it under geological anomaly and stop bringing me primitive scrap foraging as if it were a crisis. Leasai didn't argue further. Leasai simply filed the report where it was told to and kept a private copy, because something about the pattern kept ticking at the back of every thought for weeks afterward. On the other side of the line, a man named Linus Cole sat in a cloaked scout frame with a chipped ceramic mug of cold synthetic coffee balanced on his knee, watching the same numbers Leasai had seen from the other direction. "This coffee tastes like they filtered it through a boot," Cole muttered to no one, because no one was listening, and because it was easier to complain about the coffee than to think too hard about what his multi-band array had just logged. A heat spike, not from a star, not from any natural source the frame's library recognized. A subspace flare, brief and precise, exactly where the last shipment of raw ore had been routed 2 days ago. He set the mug down. His co-pilot, a quiet man named Idris who'd flown this exact patrol route for 4 years without a single incident worth logging, glanced over at the sudden change in Cole's posture. "You've gone still. You never go still." Array just caught a flare pattern matching the ore route again. "Third one this week." "Third one this month, you mean?" "No," Cole said. "This week." He didn't look up from the display. "Something's speeding up out there." The Prometheus foundry rings didn't announce themselves. They didn't need to. 300 years of quiet, careful, grinding work had turned the dead rock of the outer void into something that hummed now, low and steady, if you knew how to listen. Cole had learned how to listen. It was his entire job. He pulled up the log, checked it twice, and transmitted it without waiting for a third confirmation, because waiting for a third confirmation was how people missed things. Log entry, filed and sent. Anomalous mass transfer, Sector 7 Omega, consistent with prior 3 decades of pattern. Recommend fleet coordinator review. The reply came back faster than he expected. Just 2 words. Received, standing by. Idris raised an eyebrow at the response time. That's fast for a routine log. Nothing about this route has felt routine in about 6 months, Cole said. He didn't know yet what standing by meant, out here, after 300 years of nothing happening. He'd find out soon enough. For now, he sat back, picked the coffee back up despite everything he'd said about it, and watched the boundary line the way he'd watched it every shift for 6 years, waiting for the day the Synarchy finally remembered they existed. He didn't have to wait much longer. Vexaran did not act on Learsai's report immediately. He let it sit for 11 days on his desk, buried under matters he considered more pressing: a boundary dispute between two core world trading houses, a ceremonial appointment, the endless business of an empire that had run the same way for 9,000 years. It was the trading dispute, oddly enough, that brought him back to it. A merchant captain filed a complaint that his freight lanes near Sector 7 Omega had gone dark, his relay boys reporting nothing but static where there should have been open space. Vexaran called Learsai back to his chamber. "Your anomaly," he said, tapping the merchant's complaint against his palm. "It's interfering with commerce now." "It's been interfering with commerce for months. High Arbiter. I filed 3 follow-up reports." "I read the first one." Vexaran set the complaint down and folded his hands, crest feathers twitching pale at the edges. "Fine. Send Marshal Toralkai to clear it. A show of presence, a sweep of the sector, whatever primitive salvage operation the humans have built out there, dismantle it. This ends the complaints and reminds everyone why the boundary exists. 150 ships is a significant deployment for scrap clearance." 150 ships, Vexaran said, "is what it takes to make sure nobody else brings me this problem twice." A junior clerk near the door, filing the deployment order into the automated system, hesitated over the routing field. "High Arbiter, the Exiled decree specifically bars armed vessels from crossing the horizon line without a full council vote. A clearance sweep would need." "The decree bars human vessels from crossing," Vexaran said, without looking at him. "It says nothing about ours. File it as administrative enforcement. That doesn't require a vote." The clerk filed it as instructed and said nothing further. Command Marshal Toralkai received the order without much interest. Clearance sweeps were beneath him, technically, but 9 days crossing dead space beat another month of ceremonial fleet reviews in the core systems, and the file on the target sector was thin enough to read in under a minute. Human exile zone, population status, unconfirmed, presumed minimal, industrial capacity, negligible, threat assessment, none. He signed off on the deployment without reading further. 4 primary limbs, a lifetime spent conquering 14 core sectors, and not one of those campaigns had prepared him to question a threat assessment that said none. That was the whole problem, though nobody in the chamber would have called it a problem yet. Linus Cole watched the first Synarchy signature cross the horizon line from a cloaked scout post built into the shadow of a dead moon, and for a full 3 seconds he didn't move at all. Then the second signature appeared, then the third. By the time the count leveled off, his display showed 150 red contact icons arranged in standard Synarchy assault formation, crossing into territory nobody had crossed in 3 centuries. Idris leaned over his shoulder and went pale. "That's not a patrol." "No," Cole said. "That's a war fleet." He didn't waste time on a second guess. He locked the coordinates, compressed the packet, and sent it direct to Meridian on a channel that hadn't been used for anything but silence in 6 years. "Contact, 150 Synarchy hulls, standard assault spread, crossing at horizon marker 9. Request instruction." The reply took 4 seconds. "Copy contact. Hold position, maintain cloak. Coordinator inbound to ops." Cole exhaled slowly, and for the first time in 6 years of watching an empty line, his hands weren't quite steady on the console. Idris was already strapping back into his seat, checking the cloak field twice. "You think they'll actually do it?" Idris said. "The charter." "I think," Cole said, "we're about to find out what 300 years of practicing for this looks like." Fleet Coordinator Sarah Vance walked into Meridian's operations deck without hurrying, because hurrying was for people who hadn't already planned for this exact morning 300 years in advance. The brass-rimmed telemetry lens where her left eye used to be caught the low light of the tactical displays and turned it a faint, industrial gold. She stopped in front of the main plot, watched the 150 red icons crawl steadily deeper into the dead sector, and rolled the silver ball bearing across her knuckles once, twice. The small metallic click, the only sound she made for almost a minute. Coordinator, said her ops officer, a woman named Priyanka Okafor who had grown up in the foundry rings and never once seen open sky. Orders. How long since anyone's fired on that fleet? Nobody's fired at all. They don't know we're here yet. Good, Vance kept watching the plot. Let's make sure it stays that way a little longer. She turned to the room, and though there were fewer than a dozen people on that deck, her voice carried the way it always did when the words mattered. 300 years, they told us we'd starve out here. Instead, we built something they don't have a name for. Today, they walk into it thinking it's an empty grave. She set the ball bearing down flat on the console, deliberate, final. Activate the Prometheus Charter. Across the foundry rings, in shipyards buried inside the radiation shadow of dead stars, 4,300 defense platforms woke from 3 centuries of dormant silence, one relay at a time. Priyanka watched the activation cascade ripple across her board, sector by sector, and felt something in her chest that she hadn't expected. Not fear, not triumph, just the strange gravity of watching a plan older than her own life finally begin to move. Coordinator, she said quietly. My grandmother helped lay the first foundation ring out here. She used to say we were building a door nobody would ever knock on. Vance didn't look away from the plot. Looks like somebody's knocking. Toralkai felt it before his instruments confirmed it. A wrongness in the dark ahead. A stillness that had the texture of something waiting rather than something empty. Report, he said. Nothing, Marshal. No contacts, no signals, sensors read clean. That should have reassured him. It didn't. He had spent 14 sectors learning what clean sensor readings felt like right before something in the dark proved they weren't clean at all. Increase active scan range. Marshal, at this range, will broadcast our position to. Do it. The pulse went out, and for 3 long seconds nothing came back. Then everything came back at once. The tactical display didn't populate gradually. It flooded 4,300 individual contact points blooming across the screen in a pattern too precise, too deliberate, too built to be anything humanity's file said they were capable of. His shield officer made a small sound in his throat, not quite a word. Toralkai stared at the number and felt something he had not felt in 14 conquered sectors. The specific, physical cold of a man who has just realized the ground he is standing on was never solid at all. That's not a salvage operation, his tactical officer whispered. No, Toralkai said. His voice had lost the flat certainty it carried an hour ago. It is not. Behind the wall of defense platforms, deeper in the dust, something else was beginning to move. Mass readings his console didn't have a category for. Numbers climbing past anything in the hegemony's naval registry, past anything he had ever been trained to expect from a species his file called negligible. He had crossed the horizon line, believing he would find a graveyard. He had found a forge instead, and it had been burning, unwatched, for 300 years. Marshal, his comms officer's voice had gone thin. Something's requesting acknowledgement on an open channel, human encoding. Toralkai's mandibles clicked once, involuntary. Play it. The voice that came through the speakers wasn't a threat. It wasn't even loud. That was the first thing that unsettled Toralkai. No shouting, no ultimatum, just a woman's voice, calm as a status update. Sinaki Fleet, this is Meridian Actual. You are inside a declared industrial security zone. You have 30 seconds to reverse course before automated systems assume hostile intent. Identify yourself, Toralkai snapped. Fleet Coordinator Sarah Vance, Terran Outsystem Deterrent Group, 22 seconds, Marshal. He almost laughed. A single voice, giving him a countdown, as if 150 capital ships answered to a clock set by a species his own file called negligible. Hold position, he told his helm. We do not retreat from primitives. 15 seconds. His tactical officers' hands hovered over the console, waiting for an order that didn't come. 10. Toralkai stared at the wall of unfamiliar contact icons on his display and felt, for the second time that hour, the cold certainty that he had misjudged something badly. He opened his mouth to give the order to reverse. He was 3 seconds too slow. Time's up, Marshal, Vance said, and her voice didn't change at all. Execute defensive protocol. The first rail driver round crossed the distance before his sensors had finished processing the countdown ending. 3 dreadnoughts lost power in the same instant, their hulls punched clean through by kinetic rounds moving faster than any weapon in the hegemony's arsenal had a right to move. No plasma flare, no warning heat bloom, just impact, and then silence where a warship used to be. Return fire, Toralkai roared, and the order finally moved through his fleet like something breaking loose. 147 remaining ships opened up with everything they had. Plasma batteries lighting the dark in long orange arcs that should have turned anything smaller than a moon into vapor. The bolts bent. They didn't hit. They didn't miss exactly. They curved, smooth and wrong, around an invisible wall that surrounded the human defense grid and dissipated harmlessly into the void beyond. Gravitic shielding, his science officer said, voice climbing toward panic. Localized, sustained across a field this size, that's not possible with any material weave. I don't need the physics lecture, Toralkai said. I need a way through it. There wasn't one. Not yet. Not for the 4,300 platforms that had them boxed inside a kill zone built over 3 centuries, specifically for this morning. Back at the Citadel, none of it had reached the Council yet. Vexaran sat through a budget review for the ceremonial fleet, half listening, tapping one clawed finger against the arm of his chair. Leasai stood at the back of the chamber, uninvited, watching the live telemetry feed on a personal slate, the way someone watches a pot that has started making a sound it shouldn't. The numbers on the feed had gone quiet for almost 2 minutes. Then, all at once, they weren't quiet anymore. Leasai didn't ask permission. Leasai crossed the chamber floor mid-session and set the slate down directly in front of the High Arbiter. High Arbiter, the Marshal's fleet has engaged. Vexaran barely glanced at it. Then he's clearing the sector. That's the assignment. He's not clearing anything. Look at the loss column. Vexaran looked. For a long moment he said nothing at all, his crest feathers going pale and brittle at the edges the way they always did under stress. Except this time the stress didn't fade after a few seconds. It kept climbing. That number is wrong, he said quietly. I checked it twice before I brought it to you. 150 ships. Do not lose 3 vessels to an enemy with negligible industrial capacity. No, Leasai said, they don't. A senior counselor 2 seats down leaned in, having caught the tail end of it. Arbiter, if this deployment was filed as administrative enforcement rather than a sanctioned military action, and it is now suffering losses, this council has a legal problem before it has a tactical one. Vexaran didn't answer him. He was still looking at the loss column, watching it climb. Aboard Meridian, Priyanka Okafor watched her own displays with the particular stillness of someone who had trained for this exact morning since she was 19 years old, in a foundry ring under a sky she'd never seen. Coordinator, enemy fleets returning fire on the grid. Shields holding at 98%. Good, Vance didn't look up from the main plot. Bring the second wave forward. Out in the dust, clouds passed the defense platforms, in the deep shadow where the light of dying stars didn't reach. 800 matte black hulls began to move for the first time in 300 years of silence. They didn't rush. There was nothing to rush toward. The trap was already closed. The enemy already boxed inside a kill zone with nowhere to retreat and no weapon that touched the wall around it. This was simply the next step in a plan drawn up before Vance was born, refined by 3 generations of engineers who had never once doubted it would be needed. Vance reached down and rolled the silver ball bearing across her knuckles, slow, deliberate, the way she always did when the numbers in her head were finally lining up the way she'd built them to. "Marshal Toralkai," she said, opening the channel again. "You're still inside the security zone." "Cease this attack," Toralkai said. His voice had lost its earlier flatness entirely now. "You are a colony of exiles. You have no right to." "We had 300 years to think about rights, Marshal." Vance's voice didn't rise. It never rose. "You spent them writing us out of your files. We spent them building this." On the tactical display, 800 new contacts began to bloom out of the dust, arranged with the same terrible precision as everything else humanity had built out here. Not a swarm, not a mob, but a formation, closing around the trapped Synarchy vanguard like a hand closing slowly around something small. Toralkai stared at the number climbing past, anything his training had prepared him to process, and understood, in the space of a single breath, that he had not led an enforcement action into an exile zone. He had led 150 ships into the front gate of an empire nobody, in the hegemony, had known existed. "All ships," he said, and his voice came out smaller than he meant it to. "Emergency withdrawal, now." Nobody answered him. The order reached engines that were already failing, shields already buckling under a pressure they hadn't been built to survive, and out past the last working sensor on his flagship, the 6-kilometer shadow of something enormous began to separate itself from the dark. Toralkai's flagship went dark deck by deck, systems failing not from a single killing blow, but from 100 small ones, arriving faster than damage control could log them. He watched the shadow finish separating from the dust. It wasn't a formation anymore. It was one shape, 6 kilometers of raw black iron, and it moved toward his dying fleet with no more urgency than a tide coming in. "Marshal," his helm officer's voice had gone very quiet. "We can't outrun it. We can't outgun it. What are your orders?" Toralkai didn't answer right away. He thought, briefly and absurdly, of the threat file he'd signed off on without finishing. Human industrial capacity, negligible. Someone had written that sentence in good faith once, and every commander after them had simply believed it, the way you believe a wall will hold your weight because it looked solid enough not to check. "Hold formation," he said finally. There was nowhere left to run to. On Meridian's bridge, Priyanka Okafor kept her eyes on the countdown clock rather than the tactical plot, because the plot was going to look the same either way, and the clock was the only thing that would tell her when it was finished. Vance stood beside her, and for a moment, just a moment, before the order went out, she reached down and adjusted the cuff of her jacket. A small, unremarkable motion she'd made 1,000 times on 1,000 ordinary mornings in the foundry rings. Then she picked the ball bearing back up. "Rail driver batteries," she said. "Full spread. Begin the sequence." The Terran fleet fired the way it had trained to fire for 3 centuries, without hesitation, without waste, without a single wasted round in the entire opening volley. 800 ships moved in synchronized micro-warp bursts, closing distance and breaking away in the same breath, threading between the dying Synarchy hulls like a needle through cloth. They found, they struck, they vanished before return fire ever reached the space where they'd been. No triumphant shouting filled the comm channels. No music of victory. Just the steady, mechanical rhythm of a system doing exactly what it was built to do, one dreadnought at a time, for 14 minutes that felt to Toralkai like the longest 14 minutes of his 400-year life. His own hull screamed under a strike he never saw coming. Lights failed across the bridge in rows, section by section, until only the emergency glow remained, painting everything the color of a dying ember. Through the cracked viewport, the 6-kilometer shadow of Meridian closed the last of the distance, and for one heartbeat Toralkai saw straight down its hull, a name etched in plain, unadorned letters near the bow, the only decoration on an otherwise brutal, functional machine. Meridian. Not a warship built to be feared, a tool built to finish a job and nothing more. His shields failed completely 3 seconds later. In the judicial citadel, the live telemetry feed had stopped being a report and become something closer to a broadcast, patched through to every station on the dais by an aide too rattled to ask permission first. Vexaran watched 150 ships become wreckage on the screen in front of him, watched the counter tick down through the names of vessels that had served the hegemony for generations, and felt his hands begin to shake in a way 600 years of undisputed rule had never prepared him for. Learsai stood beside him, silent now, because there was nothing left to warn him about that the feed itself wasn't already saying louder than any report ever could. Near the back of the chamber, at a small table nobody usually paid attention to, the clerk who had once filed the Exiled decree looked up from her ledger and watched the same broadcast on a smaller screen. She thought, briefly, of a paper page she'd stamped with an unread ink 300 years ago and said nothing to anyone. The datapad slipped from Vexaran's fingers. It struck the pale stone floor and cracked down the center, its screen flickering once before going dark, and the sound of it seemed to carry further through the chamber than it had any right to. Nobody moved to pick it up. The last Synarchy hull stopped venting atmosphere at the 14-minute mark. Exactly. The silence that followed had weight to it, the particular stillness of a border that had just changed hands without a single word of surrender being offered or accepted. Toralkai's escape pod drifted, powerless, in the debris field that had once been his command. Through the small viewport, he watched the black shapes of the Terran fleet hold formation around the wreckage, patient, unhurried, exactly where they had been 300 years ago when the Council first drew a line and told a species to disappear behind it. They hadn't disappeared. They had simply stopped being watched. Observer Learsai was the one who finally said it out loud, hours later, in a chamber gone quiet with a stillness no ceremony had ever produced. They didn't spend 300 years hiding from us, High Arbiter. Learsai's voice barely carried past the front row. They spent it clearing the ground for something we never once thought to look for. Vexaran said nothing. There was nothing left in the file, the doctrine, the 9,000 years of precedent that gave him a sentence to answer with. On the clerk's table at the edge of the chamber, the iron telemetry slate clicked once and went still. It had tracked ship movements across the horizon line for 3 centuries, patient and unremarkable, logging nothing anyone thought worth reading twice. It did not track ships anymore. The needle had locked at maximum value, holding steady at a number the instrument had never been built to display, measuring instead the changing mass of a galaxy quietly tilting toward the fringe. Word of the border reached the rest of the hegemony within a day. Council patrols along the horizon line received new instructions before the wreckage had even finished cooling. Withdraw. Do not engage. Do not approach. The outer void, once written off as a graveyard fit only for the discarded, was reclassified within the week as sovereign territory, a designation no Exile sector had ever been granted before and none dared contest now. 800 matte black hulls remained at the border, holding formation in the dark exactly where they'd been for 300 years, patient as the ore fields that built them, waiting to see whether anyone on the other side of the line would be foolish enough to test the new arrangement. Sarah Vance stood on Meridian's bridge long after the debris had settled, rolling the silver ball bearing across her knuckles one last time before setting it down beside the console, unhurried, the way she set down everything. Somewhere behind the radiation curtains of a dead sector, the Prometheus foundry rings kept building, unwatched and unbothered, exactly as they had for 3 centuries. They were not finished yet.